Fleet Commander Osrin Vale had 300 warships under his command, an absolute numerical superiority over the single unarmed vessel drifting toward the Threxian blockade line, and he gave the order to withdraw his entire fleet before that vessel had fired a single shot, because he had finally understood in the space of 11 seconds exactly what kind of ship he was looking at. It was called the Mercy's Reach, registered to no military authority, carrying no weapon systems of any kind, its hull marked with the universally recognized medical transport insignia that every species in known space had, over centuries of mutual conflict, agreed never to fire upon under any circumstances. It approached the blockade at a steady, unhurried pace, broadcasting a single, simple identification signal on an open frequency that every ship in the Threxian fleet could receive. "This is the Mercy's Reach, requesting passage to deliver medical supplies to the besieged colony of New Halloway. We are unarmed. We are not a threat. We are asking you to let us through." Fleet Commander Vale had enforced this particular blockade for 11 weeks, a deliberate siege designed to starve New Halloway's 40,000 human colonists into surrender, without the Threxian Compact needing to expend resources on a costly ground assault. Medical supplies, along with food, water purification equipment, and every other form of humanitarian aid, had been explicitly and repeatedly denied passage, a calculated strategy that had already produced, according to the Compact's own intelligence reports, a mounting death toll among the colony's most vulnerable residents. The Mercy's Reach was not the first vessel to attempt running that blockade. 7 previous attempts, all made by armed human military transports trying to force passage through, had ended in the same predictable outcome, destroyed before they came within 1,000 kilometers of the colony's orbital space, their crews lost, their cargo scattered across the void alongside the wreckage. Fleet Commander Vale expected the 8th attempt to end identically. He was, by every metric his 11,000-year military tradition had trained him to trust, entirely unprepared for what actually happened. "Hail them," he ordered his communications officer, expecting to deliver the same standard warning he had delivered to every previous vessel attempting to breach the blockade. "Standard protocol. Advise them to turn back or be fired upon." The hail connected within seconds, and the face that appeared on Vale's display was not what he expected. He had anticipated a military officer, hardened and defiant, prepared to force a confrontation regardless of the odds. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman perhaps 60 years old, silver-haired, wearing the simple gray uniform of a civilian medical volunteer, her expression carrying not defiance, but a kind of tired, unshakable resolve that Vale's translator implant struggled to fully categorize. "Fleet Commander," she said, before he could deliver his prepared warning. "My name is Dr. Helena Marsh. I've been running medical transports into conflict zones for 31 years on 6 different continents and, more recently, 4 different star systems. I want you to understand something before you make whatever decision you're about to make. I am not going to turn around. I have 11 metric tons of medical supplies on this ship, enough to save perhaps 3,000 lives in that colony over the next month. If you destroy this ship, those 3,000 people die anyway, just slightly more slowly than they would have otherwise. So you're not actually choosing whether they live or die by firing on me. You're only choosing whether you're the one who has to live with having made that choice directly." Vale's tactical officer, standing at his station beside the fleet commander's chair, waited for the standard order to proceed with the destruction of an unauthorized vessel attempting to breach a lawful blockade. The order did not come. "You understand," Vale said instead, his own voice carrying an uncertainty that surprised him as much as it surprised his bridge crew, "that I have 300 warships under my command, and you have approached this blockade in a vessel with no weapons, no shields capable of withstanding even a single sustained volley, and no realistic prospect of surviving an engagement you have absolutely no capacity to win. I understand that completely, Helena Marsh said. I've understood it since the day I decided to make this run. I understood it 31 years ago, the first time I drove a supply truck through an active war zone on my own planet, and I've understood it every single time since, across every conflict I've run supplies into. I'm not here because I think I can win a fight, Fleet Commander. I'm here because somebody has to keep trying to get through, and it might as well be somebody who's already made peace with what that might cost. Vale found himself, for reasons he could not immediately articulate to his own bridge crew, unwilling to give the order that 11,000 years of Threxian military doctrine told him was not merely justified, but strategically necessary. He requested, instead, additional context, buying time he did not consciously understand he was buying. 7 vessels have attempted to breach this blockade in the preceding weeks, he said. All of them armed, all of them destroyed. You are aware of this. I'm aware of all 7, Helena Marsh said. I knew every single crew member on 4 of those ships personally. I've spent the last 11 weeks watching this blockade kill people I care about, one failed run at a time, and I made a decision after the 7th ship went down that I wasn't willing to keep sending armed vessels that couldn't possibly break through your defenses. So I came myself, unarmed, because I figured if you were going to keep killing everyone who tried to get through, you should at least have to look at exactly who you're killing, instead of just tracking another blip disappearing off your sensor display. The bridge of the Threxian flagship fell into a silence that stretched considerably longer than protocol typically allowed. Fleet Commander Vale, processing a tactical situation, his 11,000-year military tradition, had genuinely never prepared him to navigate. Every previous engagement of his career had operated according to a straightforward calculus. Force met with force, resistance met with proportional or overwhelming response. The entire framework of conflict reduced to a series of calculable exchanges where the stronger party's advantage, properly applied, produced predictable outcomes. Helena Marsh had removed every variable that calculus depended on. She offered no resistance to counter. She presented no threat to neutralize. She had, with the simple act of arriving entirely unarmed and entirely transparent about her purpose, transformed the entire engagement from a military calculation into something Vale's doctrine had no established protocol for addressing. If I allow your vessel passage, Vale said slowly, I violate a direct blockade order from Compact High Command, an order I have enforced without exception for 11 weeks specifically to force New Holloway's surrender without further military cost to the Compact. That's true, Helena said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise or try to convince you this is somehow not a real choice with real consequences for you personally. I'm asking you to make a hard decision, Fleet Commander, not a comfortable one. I'm just also asking you to make it looking directly at what the alternative actually costs, instead of from behind the comfortable distance of a sensor display, and a strategic briefing that reduces 3,000 people to an acceptable casualty projection. Vale's tactical officer, increasingly uncomfortable with a confrontation that had stretched far beyond any standard operational timeline, requested quiet clarification on whether the fleet commander intended to proceed with the standard engagement protocol. Vale did not immediately answer, his attention remaining fixed on the woman on his display screen, a civilian medical volunteer who had, with nothing more than an unarmed ship and an unwillingness to look away from the consequences of his orders, accomplished something no armed vessel or military strategist had managed in 11 weeks of active conflict. She had made the war personal, in a manner his entire military career had been specifically trained to avoid. You could have sent this cargo on another armed transport, Vale said, searching for some strategic explanation that would restore the calculable logic his training depended on. You could have remained safely at New Holloway's supply depot and directed this mission remotely, without personal risk. Why place yourself directly in harm's way for a mission you must understand carries an extremely low probability of success? Because it's easy to order other people into danger from somewhere safe, Helena Marsh said. I've done that too, plenty of times over 31 years. It never sits right with me, and I stopped being willing to do it a long time ago whenever I had another option. If I'm going to ask somebody to risk their life running a blockade, the least I can do is be the one taking that risk myself. Instead of asking somebody else to die for a cargo I wasn't willing to personally stake my own life on delivering. Maybe that doesn't make tactical sense to you, Fleet Commander. It's not supposed to. It's not a tactical decision. It's just the only kind of decision I've ever been able to live with making. Fleet Commander Osrin Vale sat with that answer for a long, uncomfortable moment, watching a woman who had no weapons, no fleet, no realistic prospect of survival should he choose to enforce his standing orders, wait for his decision with the same calm, unshakable patience she had carried throughout the entire exchange, an equanimity that unsettled him considerably more than any display of defiance or desperation could have managed. He gave the order to stand down 11 seconds later, an order that would generate considerable disciplinary scrutiny from Compact High Command in the weeks that followed, an order that made no conventional strategic sense according to 11,000 years of Threxian military doctrine, and an order that Fleet Commander Vale, despite the professional consequences he understood it would carry, found himself entirely unable to regret. "Let her through," he said. "The entire fleet withdraws from blockade position, effective immediately." His tactical officer's confusion was audible even through the controlled formality expected on a Threxian bridge. "The entire fleet, Commander. A single unarmed vessel requires, at most, a temporary gap in coverage sufficient for its passage. There is no operational requirement for a full fleet withdrawal." "There is not," Vale agreed. "I am ordering it anyway." He did not fully explain his reasoning to his own bridge crew that day, and would spend considerable time in the weeks that followed attempting to articulate it adequately for the disciplinary review his decision inevitably triggered. The clearest explanation he ever produced, buried within a lengthy formal report that Compact High Command would study, debate, and ultimately fail to fully resolve, captured something his 11,000-year military tradition had never previously required him to confront. "I did not withdraw the fleet because the Mercy's reach posed any tactical threat," he wrote. "It posed none whatsoever, by any conventional measure our doctrine recognizes. I withdrew because Dr. Helena Marsh accomplished something no armed opponent has ever managed against Threxian forces in my considerable career. She made it impossible for me to continue treating this blockade as an abstract strategic calculation. She forced me to look directly at the specific, individual cost of my orders, embodied in a single unarmed woman who had made peace with her own death, rather than continue asking others to die in her place for a cause she believed in enough to personally stake her life on. I could have destroyed her ship. Every element of my training told me this was not merely permissible, but strategically correct. I found, in the moment that decision was actually required of me, that I could not do it, not because I feared any consequence to myself or my fleet, but because I understood, with a clarity my training had never previously demanded of me, that doing so would require me to become something I did not wish to become. I do not know if this represents a failure of my duty as a Threxian commander. I know only that it represents, as clearly as anything in my considerable career, the only decision I believe I could have lived with making. News of the withdrawal spread rapidly through both human and Threxian channels in the days that followed, carried by a story that resisted easy categorization within either species' usual framework for understanding military engagements. It was not a battle won through superior tactics or overwhelming force. It was, By every conventional measure, simply an unarmed civilian vessel that should have been destroyed within minutes of approaching a hostile blockade, and instead had caused an entire fleet of 300 warships to withdraw entirely, accomplishing what 7 previous armed attempts had entirely failed to achieve. Dr. Helena Marsh delivered her 11 metric tons of medical supplies to New Holloway's besieged colonists 3 days later, and continued running supply missions into contested territory for another 6 years before finally, at the age of 67, retiring from active field work at the insistence of a medical team that had grown increasingly concerned about the physical toll 3 decades of continuous crisis response had taken on her body. She gave few interviews about the Mercy's Reach incident specifically, consistently deflecting the more dramatic framing that journalists across multiple systems attempted to apply to what she insisted, every time, had simply been the only decision available to her at the time. "People keep asking me if I was scared," she told one persistent interviewer, years after the incident had become, within both human and Threxian military academies, one of the most extensively studied examples of unconventional conflict resolution in recorded interspecies history. "Of course I was scared. Anybody who tells you they weren't scared in that position is either lying or hasn't thought hard enough about what they were actually risking. But being scared and refusing to act aren't the same thing. I've spent 31 years learning that particular lesson, over and over, in more war zones than I can easily count anymore. Sometimes the only way through an impossible situation is to walk directly into it, unarmed and honest about exactly what you're asking for, and trust that whoever's on the other side of that confrontation still has enough humanity left in them to recognize what you're actually offering them. A choice. Not a fight they have to win, just a choice about who they want to be when it's over." Fleet Commander Osrin Vale faced a formal disciplinary review before Compact High Command, one that generated considerable internal debate about the appropriate consequences for a commander who had abandoned a legitimate strategic operation without proper authorization. He was ultimately reprimanded, but not removed from command, a decision Compact leadership justified through careful, deliberately vague language that avoided directly endorsing his reasoning while stopping short of fully condemning it either. He requested reassignment away from further engagement with human territories less than a year later, a request that surprised colleagues who had expected, given the controversy surrounding his withdrawal decision, that he would seek to rehabilitate his reputation through a subsequent successful campaign against the same forces that had caused his earlier hesitation. "I do not believe I am capable of engaging human forces with the clarity and detachment my duties require," he wrote, in the formal reassignment request that would itself become a subject of extensive study within Threxian military academies. "I encountered, in a single unarmed medical volunteer, a form of resolve our doctrine has no adequate framework for countering, one that does not rely on force, does not depend on the possibility of victory in any conventional sense, and yet accomplishes results our overwhelming military superiority proved entirely unable to prevent. I do not know how the Compact should adapt its strategic doctrine to account for opponents willing to risk everything without any realistic prospect of winning, motivated by something our own military culture has never needed to develop an equivalent for. I know only that I am not the commander best suited to determine that answer, having already discovered, in the moment it mattered most, that I was not prepared to pay the price my doctrine demanded." Dr. Helena Marsh passed away peacefully at the age of 81, having spent her final years training a new generation of medical volunteers in the specific, demanding discipline of humanitarian work within active conflict zones, a discipline she insisted, every time she taught it, required far less courage than most people assumed and far more simple, stubborn consistency than most people were willing to sustain. "Courage is easy to talk about and hard to actually practice," she told her final graduating class, months before her death, in a recorded lecture that would eventually be studied alongside Fleet Commander Vale's own formal writings on the incident that had briefly made them both, against both their wishes, symbols of something considerably larger than either of them had ever intended to represent. What actually matters isn't being fearless. Nobody's fearless. Not really, not if they understand what they're actually risking. What matters is deciding, ahead of time, exactly what you're willing to stand behind even when it costs you everything, and then showing up, consistently, unarmed if that's what the moment requires, and trusting that most people, even people trained their entire lives to see you as an enemy, still have enough humanity left in them to recognize the difference between a threat and an honest, unarmed request to simply be allowed to help. That's not magic. That's not even particularly rare. It's just harder than most people are willing to practice, most days, when the stakes are smaller and the choice feels easier to avoid making at all.